I'm Louisa Stevens. I'm 57 years old, and here it is, August 17th, 2004. I'm in the story booth at Grand Central Station, New York, and I'm interviewing Patricia Adams, who is my neighbor.
I'm Patricia Adams. I am 63. It is still August 17th, 2004, and we're here in the StoryCorps booth at Grand Central Station in Manhattan. And my relationship to Louisa is that we are neighbors in Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. My background includes, I'm here today to talk about my dad, the Reverend Dr. Alger L. Adams. I am the great-granddaughter of Eugene Jett, who was my great-grandfather, and he from Louisiana. He was born into slavery, and at the time the master of the plantation died, he made no distinction among his three children, of which my great-grandfather was one. And so a third of the estate was left to him. My mother, Jessie Wells, grew up on that farm. My dad is the son of Lemuel and Lucille Adams. Grandfather Lemuel was also born into slavery. So I am two generations from slavery, and I want to talk about my dad and what his journey has been. He was born on August 1st, 1910, in Omaha, Nebraska. And he grew up with a brother, Gerald, and a sister, Sylvia. His father, my grandfather Lemuel, was a barber there in Omaha, Nebraska. Grandmother Lucille left the family when the children were still teenagers to go pass for white. We are African American. When Dad was 17, he was encouraged by his local bishop in the Episcopal Church to apply for admission to Hobart College, which is now Hobart and William Smith College in Geneva, New York. Since it was an Episcopal school, and my dad had always had an interest in being an Episcopal minister. The Omaha bishop and the bishop there at Hobart arranged for Dad to get a full scholarship, including tuition as well as room and board. And Dad got on the bus from Omaha with $17 in his pocket and took the long bus ride to Geneva, New York. When he arrived there and arrived on campus, they took one look at him and they said, oops.
But hadn't they known? They hadn't known?
Somehow, no. No, and I have gone through that with so many people,
right? Because it's such an obvious
at Hobart,
question.
And no, it's for some reason. My own spin on it is that the two bishops involved were having a little sport with the culture of the U.S. at the time, and they knew that my dad had earned the right to be there. He had the brains to be there. There was no reason why he shouldn't be there. And so it was right and appropriate for Hobart to be presented with that challenge. Now, that's my spin on it. The truth is we don't know. I have visited Hobart, and I have talked with people there. I have talked with people who were in his graduating class. No one seems to know what the real truth of the story is. But I'm getting ahead of myself. When he was told that he could attend classes, but that he could not live on campus because of his color, he went into the town of Geneva and looked for the section where other Negroes lived. And when he announced who he was, they had known he was coming. They knew that there was a young man of color in town. And I guess they didn't know he was coming, but once he got in town, they knew he was there.
They knew he was there.
They knew that the school had told him he could not live on campus. And so when he arrived...
Excuse me, Patricia, what year was that?
1929.
Mm-hmm.
1929. He was taken in by Nettie and Joe Dugan. there in Geneva, New York, where he lived for the 4 years he was in school. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa. One of the interesting stories, my dad worked his way through school in any number of ways. He has had bitter memories, really, of what it was like to be smarter than everybody else and yet doing menial tasks, forced to live off campus, on his knees, polishing the brass in the hallways of the classroom buildings, and other students, white students, walking by and ignoring his presence. When graduation time came, he was walking across campus, as he tells the story, and he saw other students with these little green ribbons. And finally somebody said, "Hey, Ed, where's your green ribbon?" And he said, I don't know, what that is. Why should I know what a green ribbon is? And they said, with your grades, surely you're graduating Phi Beta Kappa. You need to go up to the registrar's office and see what's going on. Dad went up to the registrar's office and he asked. He said, am I graduating with honors? And they hemmed and they hawed. And, well, you know, Mr. Adams, we realize that you've qualified for Phi Beta Kappa. We really don't know if we can give that honor to somebody of your color. But to the credit of Hobart College, integrity won out, and my dad was awarded his Phi Beta Kappa. It is the only thing I ever wanted from him, and I wear his key proudly. The end of the story in terms of Hobart College is that 50 years later they invited him back for and gave him an honorary doctorate. When my dad graduated, he was awarded 2 scholarships, one to the Harvard Graduate School of Business and one to General Theological Seminary in New York. My dad had always been interested in being a minister, and he also knew that as a practical matter, a black man in 1932 with an MBA wasn't going to be able to make much use of that degree. And so he went joyfully to General Theological Seminary, still on West 22nd Street, West 20s rather, in Manhattan. Graduated with honors.
Of the early 30s, right?
Yes, he would have graduated, 35, 37. I don't have the exact dates with me. Should have brought those dates. Yes. And he spent some time. He was not immediately assigned to a parish. He spent some time as a journalist on the Amsterdam News, Manhattan's black newspaper. He worked as a probation officer. During the World War II, I guess it was, he worked on the WPA. And at some point in 1935, he met my mom, and they married in 1937.
Could you tell a little bit about that?
Mother, her name is Jessie Margarita Wells, was her maiden name. And she lived at the local Y. She had been a student at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and she and my dad met. As a matter of fact, she was on roller skates. She's how she tells the story. That was how she got around Manhattan, on her roller skates. And when she met my dad, he was dating somebody else who lived at the Y. And Mother, I guess, made quick work of this lady. And in 1937, she and Dad were married. They lived in the Bedford-Stuyvesant area of Brooklyn. Let me back up. They first moved, I think, into 409 Edgecombe Avenue in Manhattan, Upper Manhattan, which is the part of Harlem known for where the upper-class blacks lived. And
I think it was Chester Himes territory.
I'm sorry?
Chester Himes territory.
I guess, yes. But I still meet people today in 2004 who talk about 409. If you lived in the 409 building, you were in the building. When I was 5 years old, we
Well,
moved.
excuse me, Mom. Were you born when they lived in 409 or when they moved to Bedford-Stuyvesant?
I think when they moved to Bedford-Stuyvesant.
Uh-huh.
When they moved to Bedford-Stuyvesant. When I was 5, we moved to Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. My parents found a house where I live today, and the house was located on a street and in an area where there were 2 other black families. One of those families, the Gray and Chance family, included a woman who was the first black woman admitted to the bar of the state of New York, Lucille Chance. And the other family was Dr. Tommy Patrick and his wife, Tony, and he was my pediatrician. Anyway, we moved into this lovely area, and nobody seemed very interested or concerned about it. In a way,
one way or another.
No, nobody cared. We were just there, and my dad was assigned to 2 churches there in Westchester County, St. Augustine's in Yonkers, New York, and St. Francis in Elmsford, New York. Neither parish had its own property or its own structure. And my dad assumed leadership for these congregations. And over the years, within a 10 to 15 year period, in both cases was able to raise the money to buy property and build the structures that still exist and build the churches. And many of the parishioners and their children and families that were there then are still there. I attend one of those churches today, and there are people there who've known me since I was a baby.
It's incredible.
So it's very, very nice, yes. Dad was a real visionary, and he could see that there was an opportunity for black people in Westchester County to come together, to create something together. I remember when he was when they were fundraising for the churches, he knew that fish fries and dances were not going to build buildings and buy property. And so he went to the local businesses, the banks. We didn't have a lot of corporations in Westchester County in those days. But whatever was there, he went to the people with the money and told them what he wanted to do, and was able to get space donated and hotels, food donated by different chefs and kitchens. And he was about the business of giving $1,000 a plate dinners and $500 a plate dinners. They came into Manhattan. Lady Iris Mountbatten and Lord Mountbatten who lived in Chappaqua, were very taken with my dad and very taken with his mission in life, and they helped him pull together the money and attract the people. Harry Belafonte was a contributor in terms of his time and his talent to help. Diane Carroll, who's from Yonkers, New York, in those days was unknown and was trying to get a start. And my parents made a place for her to perform. So there was a lot of activity in terms of really pulling together and what we would say today, networking the black community.
Was the fundraising completely directed at the black community, or was it wider than that?
Oh, the fundraising was out of the white community for the black community.
Oh, so it was basically, right.
Oh, yeah. And the truth of the matter is that the congregations of these churches were not, they could not afford to come to these events. And so in many ways, my dad did the right thing the wrong way. Because he alienated a lot of the parishioners who would have rather do fish fries and dances and that sort of thing. But Daddy knew the money wasn't going to, that they would be able to generate, just would not build the buildings and buy the land. They just wouldn't. And he was very results oriented. And so he went ahead, and of course, the proof of the pudding is in that both structures still exist, both churches still exist, and 50-some years later, they've both celebrated their 50th anniversaries very proudly, and very visibly showcase my dad and his contribution. But at the time, it was radical, and it tended to exclude a lot of the parishioners. One of the obvious outcomes of my dad's work with the church was to realize that the Black community, in addition to the church, needed to have a voice that could speak in education, could speak in politics, could speak in housing. And in those days, in the 1950s, in Westchester County, there was a lot of segregation, a lot of discrimination. There was a real need for the Black community to come together, be able to articulate our own issues, and be able to start forming a political bloc that would make a difference. My parents were aware of a newspaper that was available called, what was Mrs. I've forgotten the name of what the newspaper was called, but they purchased an existing newspaper and renamed it the Westchester County Press. This was in 1951. Excuse me. The Westchester County Press published every week, and became the center focus of the Black community and their ability to communicate to the world, communicate our wishes, our concerns, our angers, our happiness. And it was very much a local community newspaper. And it also...
Excuse me, Patricia.
Yes.
I just have a few questions bubbling.
Of course.
With the paper as a forum for speaking, so who read that paper? Was it
the Black community?
Oh, so it was a Black community discussion.
Absolutely.
And the parishioners of the church, were those integrated churches, or
No, they were Black churches.
Uh-huh.
There was no integration in those days among the churches. As someone just recently said, even in 2000, Sunday is the most segregated day in America, and it still is.
Okay, and I also wanted to hear more about in the networking, the Black community. You said that he saw the need, so the newspaper was a very important part of it, and the churches were a very important part of it also, right? Or were they?
Yeah, I'm not clear about what you're asking me.
I was interested when you were saying that your parents saw a need for the Black community to get together, to form networking situations, and you were talking a little bit, throwing some names around in the arts. I was wondering more about that community.
The focus was always in terms of a political and economic bloc, because the issue was economic. I mean, my dad was a very practical man. You know, he was not about doing things because they were necessarily because they felt good or looked good. I mean, he cared that people couldn't get housing, that people couldn't get education, that people couldn't get to the local polls to vote. He cared about very practical matters, and so networking involved going into the Black community where Black people were. I mean, the barbershops, the beauty parlors, the churches. The small businesses, and getting people to start working together and talking about what our issues were, and to start moving together as a block in Westchester County to create better conditions. Does that?
No, that does answer.
Does that answer a little bit? Okay.
And so then your father was sort of leading the way in a way.
My dad, along with lots of other people, but yes, my dad was clearly out front leading and seeing the need and pushing for his own people.
And then he did, in fact, have a greater voice. I saw those pictures of him with Nixon and with Johnson.
Indeed.
So not to get too far ahead, let's go back to the newspaper, the Westchester.
Well, you raise a good point, and this is the place to include that. The White House every year invited Black publishers and members of National Negro Publishers Association, NNPA, invited members of NNPA to come to the White House to talk about Black issues. And so I have photographs of my dad sitting in the conference room with President Nixon, with President Johnson, and with his peers, other Black publishers.
And you have letters from those.
And we have letters from
right.
and every year he was invited to the Rockefeller estate for the regular publishers event that Rockefeller had every year when he was governor. And I had the fun of going with my dad to attend those. My parents also had some dreams of their own. My mother loved the idea of traveling, and she really, really wanted to travel. And they both loved the notion of travel. If I could back up a little bit, when I was quite a little girl, they used to take me out of school every year, every winter, and we would drive south. And this was before Black people were allowed to stay in hotels. And so we would drive along during the day, and when it was evening and we decided we were ready to stop, we would drive into whatever was the closest town and go into the center of town and approach the police, and we would say, where is the colored section? Because that's what we were called in those days. And the police would direct us. We'd go over there down the road, across the tracks, and would send us on our way. And we would go and we'd drive around those neighborhoods until we found the largest house on the block. And Mother would get out of the car and she would go knock on the door and she would introduce herself. I'm Mrs. Jessie Adams, my husband Reverend Adams, and our daughter Patricia are traveling south. We're ready to stop for the evening, and we wonder if you could recommend some place where we might spend the night. And inevitably, the answer was always the same. Mrs. Adams, bring the Reverend and your daughter in. You must stay with us. And for years, we traveled like this. I think even after the hotels opened up, it was such fun. We met so many interesting people.
Did you keep in touch with any of those
we
people?
We did.
Yes.
We did. I remember in particular a family named Acosta that we met in, I think it was North Carolina. So from this traveling, through the newspaper, my parents additionally started getting ads from airlines, steamship lines, that sort of thing. And it made them realize that what they could do, particularly in the 50s now, when you had the days of what are called due bills. And this is where you exchange goods and services for publicity. So American Airlines, Trans World Airlines, Pan Am, they were delighted to give free passage in exchange for publicity in the Westchester County press. What my parents leveraged from that, of course, would be they'd decide where they wanted to go. They would contact a tourist board, and then they would, to arrange the trip, they would contact hotels. Again, the due bill situation. Hotels were delighted to put them up in exchange for being included in the piece. And they built this to, it was really Mom who did this. She built it to such a large extent that we eventually had a whole 8-page section in the newspaper called Good Living. And Good Living did indeed provide a lot of good living to the family. We always had champagne in the refrigerator, always had caviar, fresh caviar, lived very, very well, very much beyond what we actually had in real income. My parents were very clever that way. As they grew older and as they started making inroads and impact in the Black community, and also saw how they could use travel to make life more exciting, they also knew that they needed to do something really substantive to make some money. And publishing a weekly newspaper really did not provide a living income. And the money in that business comes through printing. The printer who published the county press for many years, a man named Burton T. Bliss, Mr. Bliss funded the newspaper for, as he put it to my parents, let me take care of the print bill until the paper is self-supporting. And he did that for, I don't know for how long, actually. I bet for a couple of years, though. And the paper did become self-supporting because it was the only black newspaper in Westchester County. It was at a very volatile time racially, I think, in the U.S.
Late 50s and 60s.
Right. So businesses were receptive to be reaching out and supporting something like the county press. My folks realized, though, that they really needed to make some money, and so they decided to open a print shop. And this was a window of there was a window of opportunity between letterpress and desktop publishing, and it was called offset. Offset printing was the window of opportunity where my parents made a lot of money. And what they did was they went after a market that no printer wants to be bothered with. That's the school newspaper market.
Oh, interesting.
The kids are a pain in the neck and the money is slow. But
it's sure.
That's right. That's exactly right. But the money is sure.
Right.
And so they found a building that they wanted to buy right there in Hastings. And they went to the local bank where some years ago they had...
Well, let's just backtrack.
Okay.
That's an interesting story. We'll
All right.
come back to this place at the local bank.
All right.
But earlier, your parents had the newspaper and they were running advertisements, and the bank advertised in this.
Yes.
So when was that, like early 50s?
That was early 50s, mid 50s, I would say, mid to late 50s. The bank's issue was that they were under siege by local groups, the NAACP and the Urban League, because they were not hiring blacks, or they were hiring blacks in the most menial of jobs. And so, of course, the community looked to my parents for support. The black community looked to my parents for support. And the banking community looked to them for support. And the Westchester County Press was able to play a key role in bringing those two communities together.
And it's really because the bankers came to your father and said, please help us.
That's right. What do we do?
Yeah.
They had a relationship with my parents. The bank did. Long ago, my parents had fought the battle of, you need to advertise in the county press. You have black people depositing their money in your bank. You need to reciprocate. Yeah. And the bank agreed. And so when the time came that they were under siege to be better employers, more inclusive employers, they turned to my dad and said, what do we do? And my dad said, it's really real simple. Hire some people.
And your father even steered them to some people, right?
That's right. And through the newspaper, recruiting ads. And then, of course, the people who were in the church, there were, lots of black college graduates and people with plenty of qualifications from which the bank could choose.
So your father helped the bank out in the early 50s, and now let's come back to that spot where your parents wanted to buy the building.
Still in the 50s. No, I'm sorry. Now we're into the early 60s. That's right. Now we're into the early 60s. My dad decided, dad and mom, because they really were partners. They really were partners in everything that they did. They went to the bank to take a mortgage on the house to buy this building in Hastings. First mortgage they'd ever taken.
Paid for the house in cash.
Paid for the house in cash. Daddy did not believe in credit. And when they went to the bank, of course, the bank remembered them fondly. This was the old county trust company, and there was a Mr. Wilson who was the chairman of the board. And they went and they told Mr. Wilson, showed Mr. Wilson their numbers and said, this is what we need to buy this building. Mr. Wilson said, of course we can give you this money. Is it enough? Wouldn't you like some more? My folks said, no, this is what we need.
We don't believe in credit,
That's
really.
right, don't believe in credit, right? So they built this printing business, and coming back to, they went after the high school and college newspaper market. And over a 15 to 20-year period, ended up publishing. They really had a corner on that market in the tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. The colleges and newspapers loved them. Daddy even went back to school at age 55. He went to Columbia and got a degree in journalism so that they could make it more of a workshop for the kids. And I have lots of photographs of my dad with the kids, showing them how to lay out. And see, offset lent itself to touching the work, because you had to physically type up the copy. You had to physically lay it down and make it fit on what are called flats. And so the kids were really able to learn about production. And the kids really felt ownership for the newspapers when they were published.
What happened? Did the kids come to the
Kids came to the shop.
They came to the plant.
And they came to the plant, and the plant was organized in a way that made them welcome. And my folks loved working with them. And
was there any racial issue?
Didn't seem to be. If there was, well, actually there was one. Our manager was white, a fellow named Eddie. And occasionally people would come into the print shop, and my dad would be sitting in the office, and they would look at Daddy and they'd say, "We'd like to talk to the manager, please." And my dad would say, "Of course, wait just 1 minute." And he'd go get Eddie. So, I mean, my dad's theory was, don't get emotional about the money. We can go out here and fight and march and do all that other stuff, which is the right thing. But when it comes to the money, be very practical. So, but I don't recall stories or incidents. No, not really. Not when it came to the business. Mm-hmm. Not when it came to the business.
I'd like to loop back with another question about. You said that I forgot the term you used for goods in exchange for publicity.
Due bill.
Dubill.
Dubill.
Dubill. And at that time, so your parents printed advertisements, or did they actually write articles about the travels, and when they would get. Oh, both.
Oh, I see what you're asking.
Yes.
No, see, from an advertiser's perspective, there are paid ads, and then there's publicity no money can buy.
Right.
Most advertisers would prefer to get the publicity no money can buy.
And so that was in the Good Life.
Exactly, in the Good Living section.
Good Living
yes,
section, right.
Yes, exactly.
So they actually wrote articles that people would read about their travels.
Exactly. Exactly.
And the adventures they had with their little daughter Patricia and
no, at the articles that they were writing about the countries they visited. I mean, the Portuguese sent them to Mozambique and what's the other one in French? Portuguese Africa. There begins with an A, but that's all right. I won't waste our time trying to remember. They did so much of that. By then, I mean, I was a young adult, and I wasn't traveling with them. I was doing my own traveling. They traveled extensively. And then they eventually sold the newspaper. The newspaper is still published. They sold it in the mid-'80s. First they sold the newspaper, that's right. First they sold the newspaper. And they sold it to M. Paul Red. That's his name. M. Paul Red is the current publisher in 2004, and he still publishes the newspaper every week. It is called the Westchester County Press. They just celebrated their 75th anniversary. I went and spoke. So all of this is still tied together in a very special way. The same black families that were on the street where I live are still there. We are now second and third generation in the same houses. So it's a very close-knit community.
It is a close-knit community.
Both my parents died of cancer. My dad died in 1992. My mother died in 1997.
Where were you at that time? Where were you living at that time?
Oh, I personally was living in Massachusetts. So I was close.
Right. So
I was close. I was able to come home. I came home frequently.
So your father really had a major impact in the politics and the social culture of the time. But I'd really like to know a little bit about how he was as a dad.
Oh, he was a wonderful dad. I told you a story earlier I'd like to repeat.
Let's hear.
And that's the story
The
about how
lesson.
he taught me about finance. I was 7 years old. And it was a Saturday morning, and he told me that I was old enough now to get an allowance. This was in 1948. And he gave me a quarter and told me it was my allowance and that every Saturday I would get 25 cents. I would get this quarter. So, of course, I took my quarter and I went down into the village of Hastings and I spent it. The next morning was Sunday, so obviously we were going to church. And I said, Daddy, I need money to put in the plate. He said, you just got your allowance yesterday. Where's your allowance? I said, well, I spent it. He said, well, then you won't have any money to put in the plate. Oh, I said, is that how this works? Okay. Thereafter, I understood. You can only spend what you have and you must hold back for what you need. The other lesson he taught me was that I had this piggy bank, and we would periodically open the piggy bank. I was always encouraged, if anyone gave me money, to put a portion of it in the piggy bank. So we would periodically open the piggy bank, and there was always an extra $5 or $10 in the piggy bank. What I have realized, magically, what I've learned as an adult is that earn the money, save it, leave it alone, and it will grow. That was the message he was trying to get me to that's what he was teaching. And I learned. He also, probably one of his greatest gifts was just a deep and abiding faith in God and our Lord. And I find that that faith warms me even in the worst of times. He was not self-indulgent, and yet he spoiled me outrageously. In his will, he left me $1,000, which he said was designated to be spent on frivolous frippery, so that I would understand the indulgence in which he loved me.
Oh, that's very, very nice. Actually, could we seize 2 minutes, the last 2 minutes? And there are two questions I want to ask you. Choose one. One of them is the very beginning part you were talking about your grandmother leaving the family and passing for white. That was a very provocative little bit. Either talk about that or talk more about your childhood, your mother and father, when you were a little girl. Just for a minute.
Gosh. Growing up in Hastings as the only black child in my grade was very difficult and very painful. And my parents must have been up at that school every other week or month or what have you, demanding my rights. So it was not easy racially growing up, and it was a little there's a good news, bad news scenario. I mean, it was a beautiful area in which to grow up. It was also very confusing as a little girl, and my parents were wonderfully supportive, and tried to teach me pride in my race and in them as a family and in the wonderful people who came into our home and were part of our lives.
Very, very interesting. Thank you so much, Patricia.
Thank you so much, Louisa. I really appreciate it.